one of the things you need to know about me is, besides doing random videos, I'm also really obsessed with history, especially medieval history in the time of England. Um, so today we're going to go through the latter stages of the House of Plantagenet, between the York and Lancaster stages, and then move on briefly to the House of Tudor. In 1461, Edward IV had seized the throne from Henry VI, the boy king that had ruled England for nearly 40 years by then. In 1471, he had taken the throne again. By this time, Henry VI's son, the heir of the House of Lancaster, was killed, therefore eliminating any threat from the House of Lancaster. Now, let's backtrack. In 1461, when Edward first took the throne, he basically was a person vying for power. In 1464, he married Elizabeth Woodville, the daughter of a lowly lord of nobility, and a little upper nobility on the side of her mother. In 1464, he had married her. However, most people were outraged at the decision to marry Elizabeth Woodville, as John Neville was wanting him to marry Lady Butler, who would die in 1468. And this was the reason why Titulus Regius would later be passed, but this would be after Edward had passed. In 1470, he was briefly deposed by Henry VI, who had briefly took the throne on April 9th of 1470. On April 11th of 1471, he took back the throne by conquest and imprisoned Henry VI, later having him murdered in 1471 in the Tower of London. We don't know how he died, but we do know that he was murdered. In their temporary suspension of their rule, Elizabeth Woodville had given birth to a legitimate male heir. Put an asterisk by that, because that is technically what it is, but it gets a little more complicated. In 1471, he had took back the throne, thus making Edward the heir to the throne, and he died in 1483, but not before executing his own brother, George Plantagenet, on charges of treason. And his Bill of Attainder barred any descendant of George from ever taking the throne. George was then executed in the Tower of London on February 18th of 1478, at the age of 29. In 1483, he unexpectedly died at the age of 40, leaving leaving the English throne to his son Edward. Now, this is where it gets a little more complicated, as it should have gone smoothly. However, in his will, he had named his brother Richard Lord Protector, basically as a regent under his son, Edward V. However, Richard was not satisfied. Edward's coronation was scheduled to take place, and by this time, the Edward I'm referring to is Edward V. Edward V's coronation was slated to happen on June 25th of 1483. However, Richard had issued the document Titulus Regius, basically declaring that Edward had been pre-contracted to marry Lady Eleanor Butler, thus making his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville null and void, and making any offspring that he had with Elizabeth, aka Edward of York, Richard of Shrewsbury, and Elizabeth of York. Those children were illegitimate. However, Richard was crowned king on June 26th of 1483, but he couldn't even enjoy ruling England because he had to fight off the Lancastrian threats, which he failed to do. And on August 22nd, 1485, he was struck down at the Battle of Bosworth Field. And this brings us to Henry VII. Henry VII had retroactively declared that he had claimed the throne by right of conquest. That means he hadn't inherited the throne. He basically fought and earned it by right of invading. But he wasn't an invader, as he was also a relative from John of Gaunt. However, his side was illegitimate. The Beaufort side of the Lancastrian household was illegitimate. But his mother, Margaret Balfour, was fighting for him to take over as an alternative for Richard. So on August 22nd, 1485, he had fought at the Battle of Bosworth Field. After, on August 21st of 1485, declaring by right of conquest, he had also had Edward, Earl of Warwick, executed. He had him arrested on August 21st, 1485. He had him executed on November 28th of 1499. Edward, Earl of Warwick, was only 24. Richard was only 33 when he was struck down at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Henry, although from the opposite side of the Plantagenet spectrum, was from an illegitimate branch of the House of York. However, he could resolve this issue by marrying Elizabeth of York, Richard's niece, and Edward IV's oldest child and oldest daughter. She was 19, almost 20. He was 28, which he was 29, which isn't, which I don't justify it, because he took over, but in order to legitimize his claim, he had to marry the rightful heir in the House of York, which in this case was Elizabeth of York. By then, he had wanted to marry Elizabeth of York. He did, and in 1485 and in 1486, they conceived a child, Arthur Tudor. In 1487, Elizabeth of York was officially coronated as Queen Consort. However, she was the technical heir because her brothers were presumed disappeared. Her uncle's children were declared illegitimate, and her father had died. So she would have had the rightful position as heir to the throne. But she couldn't. So she married Henry VII. And in 1491, they had a child, Henry VIII, which is more infamous. I'll cover that in the next video. Thanks. And see you in the next one.